All right, thank you for bearing with us. We had a few technical difficulties, so I apologize for that, but we should be good now. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Becca Tennell, and I am the Program and Outreach Coordinator at the Chapman Museum. And like I said, if you could just mute yourself, that'd be great. I'm going to mute myself in just a little bit. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Hadley Kruczek-Aaron. Hadley is a proud mom, teacher, and anthropological archaeologist whose research examines the ways that class, gender, race, and religion have been lived in 19th century America. She explored these topics in her 2015 book, Everyday Religion: An Archaeology of Protestant Belief and Practice in the 19th Century, which focused on archaeology carried out at sites associated with Central New York abolitionist Gerrit Smith. Since then, she has continued to explore similar questions at sites across northern New York, including those associated with Civil War soldiers, loggers, reformers, tourists, and farmers, and especially those associated with Timbuctoo, a 19th century community of African Americans in the Adirondacks that is the subject of tonight's presentation. She's committed to collaborative approaches to archaeology in the local community. She has partnered with public institutions, private landowners, descendants, nonprofits, and other educators to carry out research and develop curriculum and public programs relating to her work. Hadley, who earned her PhD from Syracuse University, has been a professor at SUNY Potsdam since 2005, and she currently lives in Saranac Lake with her husband, Ken, and her 2 children. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hadley for her talk, Lost and Found in Adirondack Memory, an update from the Timbuctoo Archaeology Project.
No problem. Thank you so much, Becca. I just wanted to add a thank you to both Becca and to Maureen Folk, who's the curator at the Chapman. This was supposed to be a talk that was going to happen last year around this time, and I had some personal things that were going on that made me have to cancel, and I felt terrible. And so I'm so glad to be able to be with you all tonight, and to thank the Chapman Museum for hosting this series, which is such a wonderful opportunity for people to get access to local history. It's wonderful to be with you all. I'm so happy to join you virtually, even though I'm much happier in a classroom or in person. I understand that this is such a wonderful way to reach more people, and I'm happy to see you all joining me on this evening and learning a little bit more about Timbuktu. And so thank you for being here. I wanted to start, I always say that hold on, let me make sure this is working. That archaeology, I always tell my students that archaeology is the closest thing to time travel that one can get. And I'd like to start today with a little exercise for us all in time travel, and to imagine ourselves going to this spot right here, and to take the clock back to June 1849. And we're here at the edge of these woods, and we see a family. It's a family of a young family at the edge of this forest. They're in a wagon filled with household belongings. Their names are Lyman and Annie Epps, and they're there with their 2 young children. One is a daughter, 4-year-old Eveline, and the other is a son, 2-year-old Lyman Jr. Annie at this time is actually pregnant with twins. I'm unsure if she knew she was pregnant with twins, but she was pregnant with twins at this time, very, very pregnant. And they have arrived at this spot after a very long journey from Troy, New York. And so you all probably know where Troy is if you're connected to the Chapman somehow, right? But they likely went up the long road that went along the east side of Lake Champlain. And then they crossed over Lake Champlain by ferry to Westport. And then from Westport, they took a very long, bumpy journey from Westport through Elizabethtown, through Keene to what is now North Elba, and to this spot. They're at this spot, they're a mile and a half away from land, 40 acres, that has been given to them by a generous reformer in 1846. It's 40 acres of their own land. And so you can, think about this moment where they're a mile and a half in, they know a surveyor has marked out 40 acres of their own land. And I just want to ask the question, and we can all imagine this, how must they be feeling? This is a generous gift that was given from a reformer to 3,000 Black New Yorkers, and I'm going to talk about this gift in a minute. But I asked this question of how must they be feeling? Are they excited about this new future that they're going to have? Are they nervous about how they're going to be received by their neighbors and by the environment and the wilderness that they're about to encounter? Are they proud to have made it this far, right? And maybe it's a little bit of all of these things, right? And while we can no longer ask the Eppses these questions of how they felt in this moment, I don't think that we can truly comprehend the power of their story and the story of the other families who made a similar journey without considering the answers to these questions. And my goal today is to flesh out their story a little bit and to bring their story to light, to share what I've learned about this family that I've been spending a lot of time with, and to situate their story in the broader context of our understanding of our region, the Adirondack region, and the nation, so that we can have a better sense of the meaning of this moment for both this family and for the broader community and the country. I also will tell you a little bit about what we've been doing to try to bear witness to their experience in these woods and in this community using archaeology. And let me move forward here. For those of you who may have seen this wonderful documentary, Searching for Timbuctoo, by the talented director Paul Miller, you know that this has not been easy work for me. And so I wanted to give you a better sense than the film might do about why it's been so challenging, and to talk about how the work has evolved in response to those challenges since I started this project in 2009. And finally, I wanted to give you a bit of a sneak peek in terms of what's coming next for this project. And so that's where we're going today. And so let's start off by really asking the question of who is this family and how did they get into these woods? And so this is Lyman Epps, born in 1815. We know a little bit about his origin story. He was born in Connecticut, actually, in a town called Colchester, which is in New London County, just to the southeast of Hartford. It's a burgeoning New England town. It's got some industry. It had a very early textile mill, for example, brick and iron works. It was about 3,000 people. Despite this early industry, most of the people are farmers. This was a multiracial community. It was and is a multiracial community, and Lyman's heritage reflects that diversity. Lyman's mother, Candace, was a Black woman who had been enslaved in a household where she likely met Lyman's father, who was a Pequot man of indigenous heritage, who likely worked alongside of Candace in that household, not as an enslaved person like Candace was, but as a laborer, probably doing agricultural labor on that property. We know from certain records that Candace Lyman's mother was freed from that the enslaver manumitted her in 1805, and that she and Lyman's father went on to have at least, and this is where it gets really murky in terms of finding information during this period about these folks who are often erased and not visible in our official histories. I think my documentation shows that they had at least 5 children, and that Lyman was likely the last child of this partnership. I don't have record that his parents were actually married. And so he's born in 1815, so 10 years after Candace becomes free. I'm not sure exactly how long Lyman and his family are in Colchester. We know a little bit. I suspect, given that he has a reputation later for being a learned person, that he likely benefited from the fact that in Colchester, there was a school for students of color. And I think I highlight in this illustration, it's right behind the Congregational Church and where Bacon Academy is. There's a little structure in the back there in the set of trees. Can everybody see that? Are you seeing that okay? Okay. And this was a school that was founded by some of the elite members of the community for students of color. So students who were Black, students who were Native. And so they were taught by some educated Black men at that time. And so I suspect that he was a student in that school. That school is in existence until about 1840. And so this illustration is right before that school closes. We know that by the 1830s, Lyman makes his way to New York City, and eventually he meets and marries his wife, Annie, who was from Brooklyn. And eventually, we know that they moved to Westchester because that's where the birth of their first daughter is recorded. So Eveline, that I mentioned, in 1845. And then by 1846, they have moved to Troy, New York. So they're moving their way up from Connecticut to New York City and then up the Hudson River Valley to Troy. Once they're in Troy in the late 1840s, the city directories there that I'm able to see and track them show that they move very frequently each year. They're still in Troy, but they're moving from a different location within Troy, like each year. And I think the fact that they're highly mobile like this, the fact that they're moving from Connecticut to New York City, to Westchester, to Troy, and then within Troy is a very common motif for the free Black population. And I think that becomes meaningful as we start tracking their story into the Adirondacks, because all of a sudden they get a lot less mobile once they're up here. Let's see. So we've taken them to Troy, right? This is where we find ourselves. Again, they have 2 kids by this time, and they're in Troy, which, as you all likely know, is in the capital region of New York State. It's also a burgeoning community in the early 19th century, thanks in large part to its location and the environment. We know that based on its location along the Hudson River, it's actually at the head of navigation of the Hudson River. It's the head of sloop navigation, they say, which means that it's the highest point, right? The starting point from which sloops, which are watercraft that really dominate the Hudson River during this period in terms of the transportation of goods and back and forth. And so they're crucial to the economic system here in this community. They're at this nexus of the Hudson River, and eventually when the Erie Canal is finished in 1825, you're also being connected not only to New York City in terms of the marketplace, and that means the global marketplace, but also to the points west and to the growing centers that are arising in central and western New York. And so Troy is located at this nexus in terms of transportation, and it's also at a nexus of its access to natural resources and into agricultural products, right? To food, to natural resources, to the iron ore of the Adirondacks. And that's really affecting industrial development in Troy. And it's attracting a lot of people to come to Troy. And you saw that amazing growth in population in such a short amount of time because of this economic development. And so among those who are coming to Troy includes a growing free Black population. It's not a huge population, but it is growing alongside others, a growing immigrant population who are really the labor force of this economic development. So we have this vibrant, small but vibrant free Black community that is pretty much a mix of those who are born free in Troy and in the surrounding region, those who had been born enslaved and eventually freed, and I'll talk about slavery in New York in a minute, as well as free peoples who are coming from elsewhere, which is what Lyman was at this time in the 1840s, right? They're coming, not surprisingly, for economic opportunity. That's why the mobility is there. They're following where the jobs are, right? And so we are seeing those coming into the economic sector, and they're primarily working in, there's the service industry, and we know that Lyman was a waiter in Troy, in some of the hotels and taverns of this region. But there are also a lot of people who are involved in all of the maritime work that's happening along the riverfront, and as well as other types of some skilled jobs, and barbering, which is a common occupation, very important occupation for the free Black community at this time. That very vibrant and community does amazing work to establish their own institutions, including churches, benevolent societies, schools, and newspapers. And so you have one pictured here on the bottom half of this slide. This is the Liberty Street Presbyterian Church, which becomes a really important place for nurturing Black activism, and I'll talk about that in a second. It's a community center, it's a school, it's all of those things, and it's a Black church. Other benevolent societies like the African Female Benevolent Society and newspapers like the Clarion and the National Watchman are being founded in this community as well. And so that's Black-led activism. And I should say that there's amazing work that I'm indebted to by Dr. Jennifer Burns, who is a historian out of SUNY Albany, who wrote her dissertation on, it's called Black Trojans. And so if you're interested in this topic and learning more, her work is really important here. And she talks about how the Black community is very much building their own institutions that are Black-led, but they're also partnering with other biracial institutions, multiracial institutions, and partnering with other white activists, for example, other elites in the community, and other middle-class white activists who are joining them on behalf of causes for freedom, like the Troy Anti-Slavery Society. So we have this kind of two-pronged activism that is going on in Troy and elsewhere, right, of their independent institutions as well as these multiracial groups. And you'll see that repeated again, and that model and that foundation also being recreated later in North Elba. So this Black activism is nurturing a lot of activity, and including in that is participation in the National Convention movement. So it's likely that Lyman Epps was a member of the Liberty Street Presbyterian Church. I'm on sabbatical right now, and one of my tasks is to go to Philadelphia to look in the church records to try and see if I can find membership lists for Lyman Epps for the church, so that I can confirm that Lyman Epps was a member of this church. But if I were a betting woman, I would say that he was definitely a member of the Liberty Street Presbyterian Church. And he may have even attended the Black National Convention that happened at Troy at the church in 1847. And this National Convention movement, there were conventions across the country and the Northeast primarily, which had Black activists gathering to talk about the most pressing issues of the day. And that could be slavery. It was often slavery, but it was also talking about questions that affected free Blacks in the North and how best to elevate their to seek racial justice and to pursue rights in the North and in context of freedom, right, that weren't free. Right. And so at this national convention, you heard some of the best speakers of the day debating issues, and this includes Henry Highland Garnett, which we'll talk about in a second, who was a preacher from Liberty Street Presbyterian Church, but also people like Frederick Douglass that you've heard of, Alexander Crummell, James McCune Smith, and I'll talk about them in a little bit. They're critiquing pro-slavery churches. They're debating the pros and cons of establishing a college for just Black men. They're talking about the importance of the Black press. Additionally, Black women are involved raising money to finance this convention and in new projects. So it's this very rich setting where they're talking about problem solving and how to improve their situation, their social, economic, political realities in this country. Just to set the scene in terms of understanding what they're fighting up against and where this activism is rooted and what they're fighting, right? Just in New York State alone, just to give you a reminder about where we stand here in terms of the history of enslavement, the end of slavery was only 20 years prior to this, right? The Gradual Abolition Act doesn't really free people outright. It was a gift to the enslavers to delay the actual freeing of people, and it even just makes them indentured servants and doesn't actually free people. And so that freedom doesn't actually come until 1827. And as they're becoming readying, the state is readying for this change. And with the growth of the free Black community at this time, you have debates about what to do about things like voting rights for that free Black community. And at the 1821 New York State Constitutional Convention, you have people debating about whether there should be a property requirement for voting rights at this time. And you see that people very clearly want to keep Black New Yorkers disempowered, and they vote by a large majority. I've got the results here from 72 to 30 to keep the property requirement for Black men at this time in 1821, right? And so that property requirement was $250 worth of property, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but is actually quite significant. There were also some requirements for residency that were added to for Black men at this time as well. And just to give you some context, in 1825, only 298 of 29,701 Black New Yorkers possessed enough property to vote, right? So that's 0.01% of the Black population would have been able to meet that threshold, right? And so people are afraid of the political power of this new social group that's present in New York State, and they don't want them to upset the political balance. So they're keeping that rule in place, right? And so we have this notion, often the common dominant narrative is one of the North being the enlightened region, right? And that racism is something that the South had a monopoly on. But I think it's moments like this where we have to confront the racism that was embedded in the system during this period. And this is what the activists of the period are fighting up against, right? This may seem obvious, but it's important to think about. This is a large body of people who are trying to ask other people to give them rights, right? To share power, right? It's waiting for those in power to say, we're willing to share power with you. We're going to give you something that you should have, right? But people are not willing. They're not willing to recognize people's humanity and their constitutional, right? Because it's not constitutional yet, rights to this political, this political power. Okay. And I should note that this happens again in 1846. There's another constitutional convention where people again bring up this issue of Black male suffrage, and again the delegates vote against it. And so again, it's by a large margin, 62-32. Okay. The difference in 1846 is that they do also say, we're going to vote against this, but we're also going to send it out to the voters to vote on as a referendum. And likewise, the voters voted down in by a large margin as well to keep that requirement. And I should note as an aside that this would keep happening over and over again in New York State. The requirement was not eliminated each time it comes up for review. And it's actually not until the passage of the 15th Amendment during Reconstruction that Black men in New York State had the right to vote without that property requirement, right? So it wasn't until those constitutional rights are guaranteed in 1870 that property requirement is eliminated. So you can imagine, Lyman Epps is part of these conversations. He's hearing about potential solutions. He's in the mix. He's probably reading Black newspapers. He's hearing his preachers talking about these issues of the day. And he likely would have heard about a special offer from this man, Gerrit Smith, who was one of those elite white men who was partnered with the Black community. He was known as a radical reformer, a radical abolitionist. He's remarkable for his time in terms of putting his money where his mouth is, as a radical abolitionist who wanted to do something to change the balance of power and to try and make a difference in our political situation in New York State and to empower Black New Yorkers. And so he experiences these constitutional conventions and sees the results. And he decides to do something about it. In fact, he's challenged to do something about it by land reformers of the period. He was a very wealthy man. He gets a lot of land from his father, Peter Smith, who acquires a lot of land questionably as part of the fur trade. And so Gerrit Smith is managing this really huge real estate portfolio. He's known to have owned land in every county in New York State, which is quite an accomplishment. So he called himself land rich. And land reformers of the period actually write him letters. There are these great letters where he's saying to them, you are no better than an enslaver by owning all of that land, right? You call yourself an abolitionist, and he was this well-known radical abolitionist. He runs for president on the Liberty Party ticket. He's a political abolitionist. He's trying to make a change from the third party perspective, but he's challenged by these other reformers to say, you own this much land and you're disempowering the common man by locking so much property in your own hands so that they have to become renters as opposed to owners, right? Tenants as opposed to being property owners of their own on their own. And so Garrett really takes a moment where he is, remarkably able to digest that critique. And he says, okay, well, I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to do something about it. And that 1846 decision to keep that property requirement, I think really brought him to this moment where he's like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to try and make a difference, and I'm going to give away a lot of my property. And so he decides to give away 120,000 acres of his land to 3,000 Black New Yorkers, in part as a way of giving them that right to vote. This is in 1846. And so this likely is also being talked about at that national convention. It's being discussed in the newspapers. Again, it's being talked about by all of the leading Black voices. You can imagine what this moment would have meant to other Black reformers to have this wealthy white person give away that much of his wealth. He partners with those Black leaders, some of whom I have already mentioned, to advocate for this gift, because he now has to find 3,000 people and he has to distribute this. It's a massive undertaking to have to coordinate this effort. And so he partners with different Black leaders around the state. These are some of them: Reverend Theodore Wright, who is a New York City pastor at the First Presbyterian Church, and then Dr. James McCune Smith, who is the first Black medical doctor. He actually gets his degree from the University of Glasgow, has to go overseas to get his medical degree, but he was a partner to Garrett Smith for this effort, as well as Frederick Douglass. And some of these folks are also grantees themselves. Garrett Smith actually gives them land as well. They don't settle the land, but they're beneficiaries of this land grant as well. And they go out and try and find the 3,000 people. And there's more. This is just 3 of the leaders who were participating in this because they're believers in this effort. They do think that the gift of land, property ownership, and also a farming lifestyle, agrarianism, is key to economic, social, and political success for Black New Yorkers during this period. But there are some broader goals here. So voting rights is definitely a part of this. And I have some quotes here to give you a broader sense of some of the reasons for these land grants. I've got a quote from Garrett Smith, and I have one of my favorite quotes from Henry Highland Garnett, who's pictured here, who was the pastor at Liberty Street Presbyterian Church and a really well-known leader in his own time. And so you have Garrett Smith talking about the meaning behind this experiment and in these land gifts. And he says, in the development of your dignity and capabilities, the slaveholder, once you take ownership of this land and improve it, the slaveholder would, awestruck, behold what manhood, what dignity, what capabilities he had been trampling on in the persons of his slaves. His slaveholding heart would now die within him. The rod of the oppressor would fall from his relaxed grasp, and the oppressed would go free. Right? He's saying there that in the example of your success, that enslavers and other pro-slavery advocates would be not able to argue for their institution of slavery, that they wouldn't be able to say that African Americans are better off in enslavement, that they're not capable of going beyond slavery. But in the example of the settlers and of the grantees who would come to their Adirondack land, that would really take away the whole foundation for the institution of slavery. right? So in doing this, it's not only just, and I say just because it's a huge thing, was to empower free Black New Yorkers, right? But it was also to be an anti-slavery, moment. This was a nonviolent, huge movement to try to get rid of slavery, right? To as part of the moral suasion regime of trying to convince those who favored slavery that their position was wrong, that this would provide that example. And you have Henry Highland Garnett similarly echoing those concerns. And we have this wonderful newspaper account of him giving a sermon right before some of his the church members go off to leave to their settlement. And I imagine Epps is in the audience hearing this sermon, this inspiring sermon. And he says, "Take with you the spirit of freedom, plant the tree of liberty upon the mountain plains, that it may spread its branches far and wide." Right. So that this movement would have a ripple effect across the nation. As I mentioned, this is an Adirondack land gift. The land that is given, the 120,000 acres, is in Franklin and Essex County, and it's primarily in the townships that kind of straddle the border of the two. And so this effort to give away this land and to transform 3,000 Black New Yorkers into Black farmers in thriving farms, and to give them political power with this huge undertaking and with these huge goals, right, to make a difference, not only in our state, but in American history, right? What happens is that the results become more complicated than what the advocates are expecting. And in fact, of the 3,000 folks who are given land, only a small percentage actually end up taking advantage of this gift. And I could have a whole hour-long lecture about why that's the case. And so we don't have time for that, because you want to see pretty pictures of objects, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But I think it's important to consider that the move up to the Adirondacks was not as easy as here's your deed to your land and good luck, right? We could have a conversation about all of the obstacles that existed to somebody wanting to make this journey and being able to make this journey. One of the big ones that I always talk about is the fact that you would need capital to start this, to settle that land, to start a farm, right? You would need transportation, you would need tools, you would need animals, you would need help too as well, right? To clear your land, right? Think about that family, the Eppses, on the edge of their forest land, looking into this deep woods with the thought of having to accomplish this feat, right? And so this is not something that was easy for people, right? It took a lot to get there. The other thing that I always talk about in terms of what might have prevented somebody from coming is that they were hearing some bad reviews of some of the land quality and about the reception that they were getting. Once they got here, that some people were trying to dupe them out of their land, and then certainly that happened. So it was getting bad press. The other variable that I would say that made it harder for people to come up was the fact that they're in communities that had churches and community centers and organizations and family and friends and all of that. And I think it was hard to imagine moving oneself and one's family to take that risk, to go to a place that was completely different from what they knew, and that didn't necessarily have some of the infrastructure and the community that they were used to. And I think that's a big piece of the puzzle here as well. But the Eppses did come, right? Who else came? Well, they came, actually, the story is that the Eppses on that ferry ride across, in west to Westport, they meet the Brown family. And so if you know anything about this history, you might know about the connection to this very well-known abolitionist and his family. John Brown hears about this gift and he says, I want to be a part of it. And he says, I have some background in farming. And he says, I want to help these grantees. I could be their advocate. I could be their partner. And so he decides to move up here in 1849. They start off at a farm rental. He moves with his wife, Mary, who's pictured here, and his large family, although most of the kids, he has 5 from his first marriage, his marriage with Mary Brown has 13 kids, so he has quite a family. Most of those are adult aged, and so they weren't with them, but they still had a good cohort of the family with them at this time. And in that picture there, you have Annie and Sarah, their 2 of their daughters, and this picture is as of 1851, so it's about at the time that they would have been in North Elba here. And so they initially come in 1849. They only move into a rental, a farm, and then they do leave for a few years and go back to Ohio. They had actually been moving all over as well, and had come from Springfield to North Elba and then went to Ohio for a few years. And in the meantime, John Brown's son-in-law, Ruth Brown's partner, husband, Henry Thompson, builds him and the family this house, which is now part of the state historic site. This is the John Brown Farm State Historic Site in North Elba. And we know from letters that Henry Thompson was the one responsible for building this, although we have Lyman Epps' name in the rafters. And if you go and you get the flashlight along with the tour, and I think I saw maybe Cheryl, who is one of the fine, really wonderful tour guides at the farm. And you ask her for I think she's on the call. If you ask her for the flashlight, you'll see Lyman Epps' name in the rafters. And so that tells me that he might have been involved in the construction of this building as well. And they end up being close friends, both families. And I think in fact, John Brown doesn't take a lot of time in North Elba. We often say that this should be called the Mary Brown Farm instead of the John Brown Farm. But they come back in 1855 with some of their children, and they stay. They're there much more than John. John goes off and does his Kansas work, and shifts his attention to the fight to make sure slavery doesn't come to Kansas. And he kind of turns away from this experiment here, but Mary and the family remain. And then eventually, as you know, Brown is there, it moves his focus to Harper's Ferry and making a big impact on American history through that effort. And so he organizes the raid on Harper's Ferry, and he is executed for his leadership on that in December of 1859. And eventually his body comes back to the farm, and this is where he's buried along with some of the raiders. And that makes this a really important historic site. And I'm so grateful that the state has it in their hands to be protected. So Epps, even though the Browns are there to supposedly help the grantees, I would suspect that the grantees, the Epps family who ends up staying there, is actually helping the Browns, right? That this is more of a community of support for each other. In terms of this settlement, one of the settlements earns the nickname of Timbuctoo. There are different concentrations of these grantees that settle across this area, and Timbuctoo is one of them. And when this settlement is remembered and is mentioned by historians, they technically, up until recently, talk about it in these terms, that it didn't attract many people, that it didn't last long, and that the narrative of failure is really emphasized. And again, it's not until recently that that kind of narrative has changed. And so I see myself as being a part of a movement more recently of scholars who have tried to tell a different story, to try and flesh out the experience of the grantees. In my case, using archaeology. In the case of right now, I have right here on my desk, I've got Amy Godine's book, The Black Woods, which is an amazing, remarkable historical achievement on this settlement, and I recommend it. So she would be another person who has worked really hard to try and change those dominant narratives relating to this settlement. I should note other people like Catherine Butler Jones, who was an early writer in the 90s recently, who is a descendant of a grantee. And she wrote about her reflections on this history as well. And that's a really important article that appears in the Orion magazine early on that spurs some of the more recent memory about this experience. And so a credit goes to her as well in terms of this new chapter in the rewriting of this history. When I think about my own contributions and when I started this work, which happened in 2009, which is dating me a little bit, I can't believe I've been doing this for this long. I can't quit this story. My goals as part of this work were, as is listed here, which is to try and find these sites. That was a question. There was a lot of questions about, well, where exactly is this settlement? And in Timbuctoo, again, being one of these concentrations, where are the homesteads? Is there anything to find? And so my goal was to try and actually find one of them. And then once I did, to document daily life associated with the grantees who made the move. Not only to do that, but to see this as collaborative work, to not just see this as something that is my work, but this is shared history and heritage, and to collaborate with stakeholders on this work. And that has been some of the most fulfilling pieces of the work that I've been doing. It's also practical in terms of the work that I do. It trains students of archaeology at SUNY Potsdam. We have a really wonderful archaeology program that Maureen Folk is a product of here. And the field school that we offer allows students to get essential hands-on training to learn how to do archaeology and to participate in research. And so this work also allowed that to happen. And it also allowed us to tell this story. And that's also been a really powerful piece of this work. People tend to like archaeology. It's probably maybe why you're all here, is because you're curious about archaeology. And so it's allowed me to tell this story to lots of different audiences. And so how has this manifested? Well, it's been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 field seasons. So I generally work every other summer. And again, our first field season was 2009. And then we came back to related sites in 2011 and 2013. And then we shifted gears a little bit. And in 2017, I went to John Brown Farm, and that's what's depicted in the documentary. And then most recently in 2022, we shifted again to another farm that's now called Heaven Hill Farm. And I'm just going to kind of make us go through these steps so you can see what this work was in all of these places. I chose the EPSs because they're recognized as some of the grantees who stayed the longest. So I hoped that the archaeological signature would be the most pronounced, right? They'd leave behind the most stuff. We might be able to see this experience archaeologically. This is a map that shows some of the efforts that we've taken to try and document where grantees were given land in this one township. This is North Elba. It's part of North Elba where we've got this charted out. The pink shows you land that was given as part of the experiment, and the red are plots that were actually settled that we've been able to document. And the one that is the EPS is right, let's see if I can get it right here in the southwest corner of lot 84, 40 acres right there. And so that's where I pursued the work first, and had to get the permission of landowners, had to talk my way onto their property to get them to agree to let students come and dig holes on their property, which they let us do in 2009. We know about this farm based on some written records. We have census data to show us who in the family was there. We know a little bit about the Epps family and what they were able to accomplish based on newspaper records. We know that Lyman becomes this respected teacher and church leader. He actually is a co-founder of the Lake Placid Library. So he's a very impressive figure in Lake Placid. And he has this farm supposedly in the southwest corner of lot 84, which you can see on this map. This is a map where I overlaid the agricultural data or the soil quality data. And you can see that the southwest corner of 84 doesn't have any color on it, which means that it's not good land, right? So the green is prime farmland, the yellow is prime farmland if it's drained, and then the white doesn't even get anything. And so he's very much, this farm would have taken a lot to actually get something out of it, but he still is successful. And he, according to the 1855 agricultural census, grows 15 bushels of rye, 35 bushels of corn, which was a remarkable achievement at this time, 12 bushels of peas, 300 bushels of turnips. They had 4 milking cows, which made 300 pounds of butter. They had 12 sheep that produced 30 pounds of wool. They had 7 head of cattle and 2 oxen. So we know that this was a very viable farm, and we know that this was quite an achievement for its time. So we knew that there was something there. We knew that there had to be something there. So we, again, did lots of different techniques and strategies to try and find the remains of this homestead. We did what we call shovel test pits, which are small holes that we dig across the landscape. We did larger excavation units to explore. We did metal detecting to help us find concentrations of artifacts. We used other more complex remote sensing techniques like ground penetrating radar and magnetometry to look for anomalies beneath the soil without having to dig. And the result of that, those early seasons of work, allowed us to find some artifacts, and some of these artifacts may date to the Epps occupation. So what you're seeing there on the left, for example, is a cut nail that would have dated to the 19th century. But we didn't find a concentration of mid-19th century material culture, which is what you would expect to find at the Epps household. They were there from 1849, and we know they lived there until at least the 1860s. And so there should have been something there to find. But again, we're not finding enough that was datable to the mid-19th century for us to feel confident. Again, this is 40 acres in the deep woods, right? This isn't like an urban lot where it's small, right? This is a big territory that we had to cover. We probably surveyed about 50% of the likely of the lot. In those, we concentrated in the areas that would have been likely spots for a farm. At the end of our first field season, we got a photograph from a descendant of one of the later owners that said they lived on the Epps lot. And this was really exciting because this gave a window on what that experience might be like. We don't know. It's likely that based on the written records that I have, that the Eppses did not build the houses that you're seeing here, and the later owners did, but it does give you an idea of the kind of existence we're talking about here in the deep woods. And so this gave us an idea of what was going on their property. We also found this map in 1900 of a 1900 DEC map that showed, you can see the Epps lot, which is pictured here. It's still called the Epps lot in 1900, even though they didn't live there anymore by then. And then above the line, you can see that in this red box, there's structures right here and a clearing. And it's a house owned and occupied by the Lawrence family, which were those later owners. And so our goal was to dig in this location, find and dig in this location, because the thought was, well, maybe they took possession of the same spot on the land that they did, that the Eppses were located at. So we pursued that avenue, and there's still a clearing there, and we dug there in 2011 and 2013. And we used some of the same techniques that we used in 2009, and the metal detectors and the magnetometry went crazy when they saw things like this. This is right under the leaf mat. These are cast iron stove parts. You can see here there's stove doors, and then there's a medicine bottle there. I think I have a close up here of some more material culture. This is the bottom of a shoe, probably a men's boot right here. This is like the metal frame of the heel and the bottom of the shoe. And then there's shoe leather right here. You can see that right here with the grommets of the shoe right there. And then you've got lighting glass right here and here. This is probably a bottle fragment right there as well. Very rich domestic material culture. We were really excited about this. We found everything from these little objects. This is a cast iron toy horse. We found a very creepy porcelain doll face that looked up at us in the dirt. So there were clearly kids here. We found a range of domestic material culture, from ceramics, which are pictured in the first two boxes, to a pressed glass candy dish, to some other objects here. What pictured, for all you good Adirondackers on the lower left, might recognize that as a maple sugar spile right there on the left. And there in the bottom middle is a suspender clasp. And I'm getting blocked by my screen here to note. And then in the lower right is a mason jar fragment. What became clear was that we had this really rich deposit, but most of these objects are dating to the later period. So this is clearly the Lawrence occupation, what we call an occupation, right? This is not the Epps's material culture. And in fact, the object that's in the middle of your screen, the suspender clasp, you flip it over and it has a patent date on it of 1903. And so we knew that this was not the Epps's stuff. And we knew from the descendant of the Lawrence family that their house succumbed to fire. There was a forest fire in North Elba, and their property got consumed by fire. And the reason why we're seeing so many artifacts in the archaeological record is because they had to run from their house at this time, and they left behind a lot of things that, again, eventually became part of the archaeological record. And so by 2011 and 2013, I was like, okay, well, we've dug in these areas, and I feel like we've really kind of exhausted what could be the area where the Eppses were on the lot that they had been given. But what's interesting, I didn't mention before on this map, is that technically where that house is not the Epps lot, right? So they're technically not living on land that they owned, and that there's clearly some questions about survey boundaries. And that made me realize I don't even know what 40 acres to look on, because they likely were, given the results of our survey, that we weren't able to find evidence of mid-19th century material culture, is that they may have decided to live on another parcel that was better because some of the other grantees chose not to settle that land. And so this is the deep woods. Nobody's going to know where they are back there, and that they might have been a little bit flexible during those early years to settle, or the boundaries changed over time and the survey markers were not accurate. And so it became clear that this search was getting much more complicated, and that, again, that maybe we don't even know what 40 acres they thought they owned at this time. And so this made the survey even more challenging. And so I decided in 2017 to shift my gears a little bit, to take a little break from the search for the Epps homestead and to broaden our search and to say, you know, we can't find necessarily the Epps homestead right now, but let's now broaden our search to try and go to where the Eppses were and what sites were important to them, and what was part of the broader community of supporters and partners and collaborators on this experiment. And so the John Brown Farm, I was really lucky that the state allowed me to dig there in 2017 with a team of about a dozen students. And again, there we found a rich array of material culture. We found a lot of objects, in part because of some of the earth moving that was going on at the site. It became clear from the archaeology that there was a lot of landscape modification over the years. And this is a really great illustration of how that landscape modification happened to change how the land looked, but also to help protect some of the archaeological deposits. So what you're seeing here is that when archaeologists look at soils and sediments, it's not just all dirt to us, right? And so we're looking at how the change in color, we're looking at the change of texture, and you can see in this soil profile that you're seeing different colors. I hope we called this the Reese's peanut butter cup of soil profiles, because you see this chocolate brown at the top, and that's changing to this like yellowish mustard peanut buttery brown in the middle there, and then a very dark brown under that, and then a more orangey brown under that. Do you see that? And what we recognized is that that peanut butter layer, that yellowish brown, was a sand fill that the state likely covered the house, the surrounding of the house, with a sand fill to help level the property after some landscape changes were made. And what that did was cap what the topsoil was underneath. Does that make sense to you all? So that dark brown underneath that yellowish brown used to be the surface of the ground. And so you're seeing this richer deposit of objects and broken rocks and things like that in this area. And this is where we found a lot of material culture at the Brown Farm, including things like ceramics. What you're seeing on the left there is that we found only a small amount of material that could be dated to the Brown family, including that ceramic vessel. It's a teacup, a spattered decorated teacup that probably dates to the 1830s. So even earlier, could have been brought with the Brown family to get there. We found other objects, including, these are my favorites. This is a pair of sewing scissors that I always say that some woman was probably on the porch at the Brown Farm and did their sewing and they lost their scissors, and we found it 150 years later. One of my favorite things about these scissors, if some of you might be sewers, you see that it's a stork. These are stork scissors. So this is the beak of the bird, this is the head of the bird, and the body of the bird. And so these were this is still a common motif in sewing scissors, and it's associated with midwifery, that some women use their sewing scissors to cut the umbilical cord of babies. And so that's a really special object that we found. We also found evidence of daily life. This is an example of a medicine bottle. This would have been cheap medicine that they would have bought, according to the advertisement, to cure. It cures all liver disorders, all kidney diseases, biliousness, constipation, skin diseases, dyspepsia, rheumatism, and headaches. Most of these cheaper medicines are, this says Thatcher's liver and blood syrup from Chattanooga, Tennessee is what is missing there. Most of these are often alcohol. They could have been opiates, and that's what's in some of these commonly available medicines at this time. You see here other objects. We found more shoes here, shoe parts. We found more shoe heels. You're seeing a mason jar fragment on the right there. We found a lot of ceramic and glass. This is a tray in the lab that's showing all of the glass bottle remains and glass tableware. We found a lot of broken ceramic. I don't have a great picture of that. But I think what is being shown here, a lot of this stuff, again, is dating to the later period, 1870s through about 1900, when the site became a tourist attraction. And actually, they're serving food and drink at the Brown Farm to entertain the tourists that came. And so I think the huge amount of bottle glass and tablewares are likely an indicator of that kind of tourism that was happening at the site. Then we shifted gears again in 2022 to the Hinckley Holt Newman Farm, which was a farm associated with a few families that were kind of collaborators, friends to the Brown family and to the Epps family. It's a really beautiful spot, as you can see. It was called Heaven Hill Farm. It's associated, it's the earliest still standing structure in Lake Placid. You could see an earlier photo of what the house looked like there in the upper right. It's associated with the Hinckley and Holt family originally. That is Horatio Hinckley. He and his wife Amanda and their 4 children come from Lewis, New York, and buy 640 acres from Garrett Smith in 1846 during this time when he's giving away, selling a lot of land. And this includes their children, Alexis and Abigail. And Abigail goes on to marry one of the Brown boys, Salmon Brown, and they're actually married in the living room of this farmhouse. And Alexis, her brother, and so this is Abigail, a later picture of Abigail here. And her brother Alexis also describes himself as a sympathizer to abolition. He's one who's kind of thought about maybe going with Brown on the raid, but doesn't go. He calls himself an Underground Railroad supporter. He ends up owning the Brown Farm when the Browns eventually leave North Elba, which happens in 1863. So John was executed in 1859, and then his wife Mary and some of the remaining kids decide to move to California by 1863. And then Alexis Hinckley owns that farm and eventually sells it to a group of activists, actually. So this Hinckley family is connected to the Browns. They were likely, friendly or knew the Eppses. Eventually, they sell their farm to the Holts, which were relatives. It was Alexis's father-in-law, if you're following and charting this out. And then eventually the Holts sell this farm to a friend of their family named Anna Newman. Anna Newman is this eccentric woman who comes from Philadelphia. She's the daughter of a wealthy Philadelphia merchant. And she decides to leave Philadelphia. There's some, she doesn't like her stepmom. That's probably the issue here. Didn't like her dad's choice of a new mom after her mother had died. She starts this new life. She buys this farm from the Holt family. And she lives there as a single woman. And the Adirondack newspapers call her the Adirondack strangest woman, which we can critically evaluate. But this farm, Anna Newman becomes a colleague and collaborator of the Eppses. She's involved heavily in the White Church, which is the local church in Lake Placid, which is pictured on the left there. She and Lyman Epps are central to the formation of that church, so they're working together on that. The Epps family in their second home actually is across the street from this farm. And so she employs the Epps family to work on her farm. And so that's what brought us to the Heaven Hill farm to dig there, is to try to walk in their footsteps, to see what life was like on associated properties. And so in 2022, we did that. We know that, I'm not sure if it's Epps Senior or Epps Junior works and drives the team of oxen here at this farm during the last quarter of the 19th century. We dug here, found some early occupation with some of these very small ceramic fragments that we found in the backyard. These are earlier vessels. We also found them in association with animal bone. It would have been right behind the house. This is evidence of pig consumption and butchery. There's some butchering marks on this bone. And this is happening right outside the backyard. We don't usually get backyard photos, but this is a wonderful, archaeologists love backyard photos. And so this is the backyard of the farmhouse where a lot of the work was going on. And so we're probably digging right in this area. And that's where those animal remains were found, and some of those early ceramic pieces probably being swept out of the kitchen, or the butchering is actually happening right in that backyard where the laundering activities are happening. There's a water pump right there in the center there, and that's important to us. In a second, I'll show you a picture of something related. We also find a midden, what we call a midden, which is a fancy word for saying a dump, where the family or the household is discarding some of their daily evidence of daily life. And so you've got everything from huge mixing bowls there on the left. That is a yellowware mixing bowl. It probably was this big. I'm a big fan of yellowware, so this was really exciting for me. That bowl is made by a Philadelphia maker that was in business probably at the same time when she left Philly. And so she's something that she brought with her from Philly. You see everything from glass buttons to mason jar fragments. Again, even though she was really wealthy, she seemed to live pretty meagerly. She doesn't have fancy dishes. She doesn't have a lot of fancy personal items. What she does seem to invest in is this amazing water pipe system. So she is one of the very few private residences that has a water pipe that she has laid across her farm. It's about 1,000-acre farm. So again, she's a big landowner. She employs a lot of people to work the land. And she is investing her money in things like this, which was a wooden pipe that was wrapped with a coil of metal. And what you're seeing here is what the metal remained, but the wood has disintegrated. And so we dug right where that picture was taken, where the water pump was, and this is what we found. So we clearly hit the water pump that would have been associated with the working side of the house. And so this is where the laborers would have been. It's not that far away from the barn, likely where the Epps family members would have been working. And so this gives you a little bit of a sense of what farm life was like here. And so just to wrap up here, just so that we can have some time for questions, I just wanted to kind of summarize, what have we learned so far, and what are we thinking for what's next? Well, when I think about what we've been able to accomplish with all this work, yes, we haven't necessarily been able to find the mother lode of the Epps household, but I think, what the reality is that we haven't been able to find, I think, is testimony to their creative survival strategies of not necessarily, living where they were supposed to live, or that they're being creative about and to make a better life for themselves on land that might have been more advantageous. And so the fact that they might not have been on their lot and their kind of lack of visibility on that lot may be speaking to their survival strategy and their creativity and their their effort to try to make this a success. I find it incredibly inspiring and hopeful to think of their accomplishment during this period that was so challenging, especially at a time when so few of those grantees actually came to join them, that they would have felt pretty isolated at this time. And to have made a go of it, the family stays in the area until Lyman Jr. dies in Lake Placid in the 1940s. So this is something that, you've got a few, it comes into our modern, I know people who remember Lyman Jr. and remember talking to him, who are still living today. I also think of the broadening of the scope of this work to the other community members and the other farms who were employing the EPSs or working with the EPSs or collaborating with the EPSs as evidence of this kind of mutual reliance and community that's allowing them to have long life and to stay in this one spot and to become Adirondackers, right? Adopted Adirondackers during this time. That in some cases may speak to the cause of radical empathy that certainly the Brown family had for Black Americans during this time, although some of the support that they might have been getting from other farmers may not have been activist oriented. It could have been more practical in terms of what happens in rural areas to support and keep farms going. It's also about preserving memory and preserving this history and retelling this history, reshaping what we think Adirondack history is and changing who we think is Adirondack history. And I know that the Chapman has been doing a lot of that kind of work of reframing what this history looks like. It's also about collaboration and shared heritage, which is so important to this project, is to involve the different stakeholders in this work, is to educate and reach out to potential collaborators, whether that's youth groups, whether to participate in the project, or teachers. We've been doing a lot of really exciting work recently. Some of the most fulfilling work that I've done in my career recently is to partner with teachers to ensure that Timbuctoo becomes part of the curriculum in our local schools. As a mom of two kids who are in the system, this is really important that our community members know about this history and can be proud of this history. So in that sense, I do view it as the archaeology of our future, right? This is for the next generation in terms of understanding where we've been so that we can reframe how we see we're going. In terms of next steps, I can say that we are coming back to Heaven Hill Farm this summer. So if you want to come up and visit us, keep alert for announcements about our open house. We will be digging during the month of June at Heaven Hill to continue our work. The other effort I am trying to lead would be to do work with other remote sensing techniques like LiDAR, which is a technique that helps us see very subtle landscape modifications through the leaf cover, through those, really dense woods of the Adirondacks, to hopefully maybe see where farms were. And so if we can use LiDAR to hopefully hone in on some areas that hadn't been on our radar before, that tool could be used to explore, to try and see if we can find that first EPS farm. And then lastly, the Heaven Hill Farm, we are very grateful for the Eline Foundation, who owns that farm now, and also the farm that was the second home of the Epps family. So when the Eppses moved out of the woods in the 1860s, and they live on what is now Eline property, there may be an opportunity for us to dig on what would have been the Epps's second homestead in North Elba. So we have some things to deal with on that property before we can do that, but those are some of the three different avenues that we're going to be pursuing to get this, to keep telling this story. And so I want to thank you for your attention. I'm not used to talking this much without talking with you instead of talking at you. So I appreciate your attention, and I'm happy to take questions if you're still awake.
That was incredible. Thank you so much. We do have a few
Sure.
questions in the chat. I'll read them
Yeah.
aloud. Okay, so first one, oh, that's me. First one comes from William. He said, could white men without property vote in 1825?
Yes. Yeah. So
Okay.
in 1821, they made that decision to, should we make it so that it's white and black with that property freehold? So they debated that. You know, there were some elite New Yorkers, elite white New Yorkers who were like, you know, maybe all poor people shouldn't vote, regardless of race. And so we should put that property requirement on both black and white. But ultimately, they decided to just have it on black men at that 1821 Constitutional Convention.
All right. So Cheryl asks, did you look on Heaven Hill property near where Orchard is? I can't remember the name, but there was a grantee family in that area at least a few years. A friend found a stellar hole.
Yes, so that is also on our radar. So it's amazing when you're given permission to dig on this property that's 1,000 acres. You know, we could be working there for years. And so you're right, Cheryl, there is another grantee who moves to this area, a member of the Morehouse family, I believe, who lives on the Eline property in where you're talking about for only a couple years. And so it's a little bit lower on my radar because it may be very hard to parse out what is that occupation layer, right? Because if they were only there for 2 years and there were other people before and after there, it's harder for us to say, okay, well, that is the Morehouse occupation, right? It's harder to make that visible, if that makes sense. But it's definitely something that we want to survey and locate and do some testing to see what's there.
Okay. Andrea asks, is any of the original land granted still owned by the descendants?
That's a great question. So most of the land, as I said, you know, the amount of people who were given land who actually came and maintained the connection to the land was much smaller. And there were people who didn't come, but still kept their land. The biggest barrier to the land ownership was the payment of taxes on that land. So they had to keep paying the taxes. So if you didn't, you know, you technically could own that land and maybe elevate to that $250 level eventually and not live on it, right? So you could live in New York City, or you could live in Albany, or you can live wherever, Troy or what have you, and still own that land, right? But what was happening is that people couldn't even afford to pay the taxes on it. Although what Amy Godine's book is showing is that people worked really hard to try and pay the taxes, that other people were helping people pay the taxes on it so that they could own it. And that what happens is that in 1870, a lot of that land, they all of a sudden say, okay, well, now we're going to let it go because now we don't need it to vote. And by 1870, once that voting rights came to everybody at that time, not everybody, because there was only Black men, not women, and Native peoples. But once Black men were able to vote without that property requirement, that ownership of that property and paying those taxes wasn't as crucial. So they stop paying the taxes, and that land became subject to auction sales. So they were sold at auction. Some of it went to the state, and so some of that is now wilderness land. I don't think I know of an instance, and Amy Godine knows better because she knows the broader history of the whole settlement, as opposed to my focus has been more narrow on the experience of this one family. I don't think there's been continuity of ownership some people sold their land and bought other parcels. People like John Thomas is another well-known grantee who sells his land but buys a better piece of property. And but I still even think that that's not owned by descendants anymore. And so I think they moved off that land eventually.
Okay. Gloria asks, was there any type of community town where neighbors could connect socially, both Black and white?
So I think what you're asking there is a really great question, because when I think about this experiment and I think about, okay, well, what could this experiment have been if everybody came, right? If you remember that map that I showed where it was all that pink, right? If you can imagine how different the Adirondacks would have looked, and in fact, there's even more land than what's shown there that was given away, that would have been owned by Black New Yorkers, right? That community of people would have really helped allow that settlement to succeed even more, right? And the fact that they didn't have as broad a community of Black neighbors, that they had those biracial networks, right? Those multiracial networks that they're establishing relationships with their white neighbors. They had to. And they were finding, friends and employers and supporters, and also people who were not welcoming very much in the community as well. But I would say the churches was a huge institution where you had people coming together. So so religious meetings, religion, these other institutions, workplaces would have been where people were working together on these farms, like Newman Farm. So the economic networks were certainly of a mixture of people. And eventually, over time, you see even fewer grantees, because the grantees who come, many leave. So it's only a handful of the original Black grantees who are remaining. But I would say primarily probably religion, community organizations. Like I said, Lyman Epps is a co-founder of the Lake Placid Library. I'm giving a presentation at the library pretty soon at the end of this month to talk a little bit about Lyman to that crowd, because he's so important to that organization's history as well.
Excellent. All right, William's got a two-parter question.
Yeah.
So did 3,000 folks gain the right to vote as a result of these land grants, or just the 200 who actually showed up?
Yeah. That's a great question. So one of the unfortunate parts of this was that just owning the land didn't make you get to the $250 limit, right? That the land needed to be improved for it to get to that level. And I think that was purposeful on Garrett Smith's part. He didn't want it just to be like a giveaway where people didn't have to work for it, something, right? That he didn't want his critics to say, oh, well, they were just given the land and that's why they succeeded, right? So the fact that they had to invest in the land and make it improved was crucial. And it took a while for that to happen. And so you see, not all of the 200 that were there were able to get it to that. Although what Amy points out in her book is really interesting is that those local folks who were in charge of saying whether you were eligible to vote, they might have been a little less strict about, did you really own 250? Because she argues that some of the folks that were voting probably didn't hit that 250. and yet they still made it on the voting rolls. And so that's an interesting, like, North Country, neighbors are giving these folks credit for making that 250, even though they might not have made that the cut. And so that's a really interesting moment of a gift, right? Of making that happen for somebody.
And the second part of his question is, he apologizes, he might have missed this at the beginning, but he's
No
curious
worries.
as to why all of these folks, the 200 who went up there, why did they go actually? What was kind of the push, I guess?
Why did I focus? Oh, hold on. Let's see. Why did I focus on Lyman? Is
I
that the
think more it's
question?
Yeah, that's the
okay.
question. Why did you focus on
Yeah.
Lyman House?
Okay.
Yes. So Lyman was the one who stayed the longest. And so I really was hoping, because they stayed at that lot from 1849, we knew, to at least 1863. That's when they moved to their bigger house that's across from Heaven Hill Farm. So I knew that they were there for at least about 14 years. And they may have even been there longer. I suspect that Lyman Jr. lived there for a little bit of time, but he's not recorded in the census. This is another thing that the census takers probably are not going into the woods and finding those folks. So they don't make it into the record. They're not recorded on the maps because the atlas people or the drawers of the maps are not going into the woods to find them and to record them there. And I suspect that Lyman Jr. may have been living on that property because they keep that original lot until after Lyman Sr. dies. So he dies in the 1890s, 1897, I believe. And then Lyman Jr. sells that parcel. And so I think it was symbolic for Lyman Sr. to hold on to that original land for as long as he did. And he actually, you see in the tax records that he likely was using that property for its timber value, because you see in the tax records the valuation of that southwest corner of lot 84 goes down because somebody has logged it, right? So he's using it strategically for those economic resources that are on the land, even though he's not living on it. So he's viewing it as an asset. So I chose the Eppses because they were the ones there the longest. And so my hope was that would mean that they would be the most archaeologically visible. And as you see, even they were really hard to find. And I can speak a little to why they were a little bit hard to find. And that is not only because the survey boundaries were lousy, probably, or they might not have been living on their own land, but also because they were log structures. It's likely that people were salvaging the building materials, so they're taking evidence of that house away from the site. So it's probably not a cellar hole, so there are things. So it's not a big stone foundation, that archaeologists used to find. There also was the forest fire in the early 20th century, and that radically altered the landscape. And we're also talking about a landscape of poverty here, that they wouldn't have had a lot. And what they had, they would have used all of. And so there isn't going to be a huge pile of trash, right, where we're going to find them. So their signature is already going to be pretty meager, but I was hoping that it would be enough that I could see them. And so far it's been challenging, but we'll see what happens.
Okay. Cheryl mentions, kind of as a follow-up to Gloria's question, Amy, I think that's Amy Godine, mentions in her book that sometimes Black individuals were living in white households and vice versa in at least one case. So you mentioned working together. That certainly happened.
Yes, for sure.
Okay. Jordan says, I feel ashamed as I should know the answer to this question from my 2013 field school. Sorry, it's been 11 years. But were the initial grantees from all over New York State, or were they focused on African Americans from New York City?
So hello, Jordan. Good to see you on this. They are from all over New York State. So there were agents that were in New York City. And so you have Willis Hodges, for example, is another agent who advertises this in his newspaper, the Ram's Horn in Brooklyn. And so there's a cluster that comes from Brooklyn up to Franklin County in a settlement called Blacksville up there near Loon Lake. And then there are some that come from all over. So we have a copy of a big ledger that has all of the 3,000 names, and it's an incredible source that has a list of these 3,000 Black New Yorkers from every county across the state who were given land. And so that it's a lot of diversity. So not just New York City, but all over the place, including Troy, which is where the Timbuctoo cluster is primarily from.
Cheryl asks, have you thought about looking at William Appo's property? Is there an obstacle to that?
Yes, Cheryl, that's also on my dream list. This is like a 25-year plan, I feel like. William Appo is a friend of the grantee, so he isn't a grantee, but he's a well-known Black musician from Philadelphia who comes up. He also has connections through Troy. He lives in Troy too, and so likely knew the Eppses, and comes up and buys land as a kind of supporter of the settlement. And his land is also land, and in fact, Lyman's daughter marries him, William Appo. So the Eppses and the Appos are interconnected, and they live right down the street from the Eppses. And I have gotten permission, or informal permission, shall we say, that this could be something we could pursue. So that could also be an avenue we look at as well. I have a feeling that the land is heavily disturbed because there's been a lot of activity on it since the Appos were there, but I think it's still worth surveying.
Nice. And Stanley says, what recommendations do you have to help introduce sites and topics like these to teachers for inclusion in their curriculum?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've been doing these teacher workshops, and in fact, like let me see if I can get the picture back. The picture on the bottom was a teacher institute where we brought together different teachers from around the region and beyond to help brainstorm on curriculum development. And in fact, there are some of the lesson plans that they developed. We did it in conjunction with the New York State Archives Partnership Trust. And they have this wonderful, I can share it with you folks maybe by email. It's a website called Consider the Source. And there's actually lesson plans associated with Timbuctoo as a result of some of the work that the teachers did at the Teacher Institute that gives teachers a way to incorporate Timbuctoo into their curriculum. WMHT, also the PBS station where the documentary is streaming, also did really wonderful work doing some curriculum that teachers could use. So already made lesson plans using some of the historical sources. And so that's been really wonderful work that we've been doing. One of the things that I would love to do, Stanley, if you want to help me, is to get that, and this is something I've been talking to my colleagues on the board at John Brown Lives, is we have this big ledger of 3,000 names from across the state. I would love to partner with schools across the state and have the students research those names, right? To find the county and find those people who were from the area where those students are from, so that we can get those kids locally to better understand the people that were living in their own backyard who were a part of this experiment. And so that's one way of thinking about this. But I also think the archaeology is a great vehicle to get kids excited about this history, right? Because it's a lot more fun to look at stuff, right? And so, you know, using archaeology and getting students to brainstorm how objects can be used to tell this story in ways that written records can't help us tell this story is also a really powerful entry point. But I also think Timbuctoo is such a great vehicle to teach this history with students and with teachers, because in our current climate, which makes this history controversial, right, that there's a lot of debate about teachers teaching Black history and the history of racial justice in this country. Well, Timbuctoo speaks to this history. You know, this is history that we need to know and can be inspired by. And I think that students who have access to this history would really be inspired by it, right? And it's an access point for talking about difficult history, but in a way that centers Black agency and community, but also, you know, biracial, you know, allyship and accomplices and partners and collaboration within communities that I think is what we need more of today, right? And so I think it's a really powerful jumping off point for teachers to talk not only about the past, but also about the present.
Absolutely. That is the last question in the chat, but if anyone else has a question, feel free to unmute yourself or quick add it to the chat.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. It's great to see familiar names and faces and to share all of this history and to talk about this. It's really, it's wonderful that so many of you are here to talk about it and to ask such great questions. So I appreciate your careful attention. And again, thank you to the Chapman Museum for hosting. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. For those of you who enjoyed tonight's lecture, make sure you come back in March. On Wednesday, March 13th at 7 p.m., we're going to have Craig Murphy come to the Chapman, and he's going to present tin types with Craig Murphy, where he's going to focus on the process that was used in the 19th century to create wet plate collodion tin types. So he's going to do a demonstration and kind of talk about the history behind it. And if you're interested in that, make sure you check out our website and our Facebook page for more info in the coming weeks. And again, thank you so much, Hadley. This was fascinating, and we really appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you again.
All right.